even for one as pessimistic about Australia's strategic environment as I've been, the last few weeks have been quite challenging and surprising. I said on this program earlier this year that I thought the COVID-19 virus would pale alongside with other exports from China, namely its virulent ideology and regional hegemonic ambitions. I've sadly been vindicated in that we've seen an escalation of Chinese belligerence and bellicosity in the region, especially directed at Taiwan and also against Hong Kong in recent days. Furthermore, we've seen the hollow promise of the United States pivot to Asia finally laid bare. The Indo-Pacific commander admitted that of their 186 F-22 Raptors, only 33 are now available for combat. And he's also demonstrated that we've got to maintain no forward basing in Guam and no US carrier groups are available for operations in the Pacific as it stands. These are terribly alarming events. I think we'll look back on COVID-19 as being the least of the problems exported from China in 2020. I'm extremely concerned that sometime before or during the presidential campaign, we will see an escalation of tension in the Taiwan Straits, and Australia, for my money, is sleepwalking towards that eventuality. I really believe that Scott Morrison needs to take direct control and have a broad national security audit and release a statement in his name, not the Department of Defence's, and do it now. Well, what do you think about that one, Corey?
Well, Catherine, I'm going to bow to your superior knowledge of these things, but there are a couple of points I'd like to make. One is, I think, a huge military or strategic blunder by the Australian government was made under the Turnbull-Bishop government when they allowed China to militarise the South China Sea. I think there is going to be an enormous tension in regard to Taiwan ahead of the US election, as you've said. But I'm going to give a little bit of kudos here to the Prime Minister. I think his rhetoric has changed in alignment with diplomatic requirements to acknowledge that Australia is not going to subjugate itself to Chinese threats or bullying or intimidation. The question for us, and it's a question that you can answer in great smarter minds than us, is China going to move to compromise Australia's interests, and how bad will that be? And the final thing I put to you is, will our submarines that Christopher Pyne ordered be ready for the next conflict in 2065 or whenever it is?
And this is a very live question, Corey. It's one of the reasons I think we've got to have a serious look at our force structure. I know there are some senior people in Canberra now really concerned that the submarine just will not be in play in a realistic time frame. And we've got to start looking at other options. Hypersonic missiles delivered from our P-8 Poseidons. We've got to look at our mine warfare capabilities in the Straits of Malacca. I think another option is that we need to look more at the Quad, namely Japan and India, because US power is being treated. And I don't say that out of Trump derangement syndrome. It's just happened to fall on his watch that this pandemic has caused an attrition of American power. It's taken their carrier fleets off the grid, and China is being very bellicose. Nick, we've had some lively discussions about the domestic responses to Chinese rhetoric and the Belt and Road Initiative, but do you concede that China's international actions are really now well beyond reasonable great power behaviour in a time like this?
Well, look, I think one of the challenges with China is that even though they are already really a great power, they are undeveloped in their management of international affairs. And add to that the strong authoritarian tendencies of the Chinese Communist Party, and so they constantly find themselves getting into these problematic international arrangements. I think Australia's in a very tough position because, yes, we've got a rising superpower with authoritarian tendencies on one side, and then we've got an increasingly unreliable ally in the United States on the other side. And so I do agree with you that the way that Australia... So I do think the way Australia responds to this is arguably the most challenging foreign policy set of circumstances we've seen in decades. Where I do differ from you a little bit, Catherine, is look, you're a military hawk, and it's like that old saying, when you're a hammer, all you see is nails, and when you're a military hawk, all you see is a shortly to be had military conflict. And I actually think if you look at Chinese history, you'll find that 8,000 years of continuous history, they've never had designs on Australia or this part of the world, and I think they will use trade and commerce to advance their needs. I don't know they would ever use military conflict to advance them, at least in our part.
Then why are they wargaming an invasion of Taiwan literally in the last 2 weeks? Why are they probing Taiwanese airspace literally in the last couple of weeks? Why have they had collisions with Japanese and Vietnamese vessels in international waters in the last month? This is not about Belt and Road initiatives or the tone of Australia's language. These are real military actions by a superpower in a period of escalating global tension. And yes, my background's military. Yours is as a Labor staffer and a Melbourne councillor. So when I see something as a military threat, you're likely to see it as a Belt and Road initiative. And I think that's why the twain never meet. If you're a Chinese strategist, you think a Belt and Road initiative is war by other means, and they've written it. I'm not making this up. Gemma, what do you think? The West has a different perspective on this yet again, doesn't it? With the enormous reliance of some of their exporters on Chinese markets.
Absolutely, and that's primarily what's been going through my mind as I've listened to the conversation so far. But before that, I have to declare a conflict, as I always do when China comes up, and that is in my day job. My business works with a number of Chinese-owned entities. Now that that's out of the way, I think the news about the impact, particularly in the barley trade, like for our agriculture industry over here, suffering from that, the consequences of the tariffs on that commodity already, that's a big concern. Western Australia is a huge exporter to the Chinese market. But circling back to your original comments, Catherine, I think a couple of thoughts. I feel like the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has actually been getting it pretty much right so far. I feel like he's poked the panda bear to a degree that they probably didn't expect him to. And of course, that was about the inquiry and pushing the inquiry into the coronavirus. I find it, and I'm not a military person, clearly. I got thrown out of the Girl Guides in Year 5 in primary school because I was hopeless. But I find the idea of a military threat so inconceivable. That's just my own sort of, I guess, framework, and I think probably I'm not alone there. That doesn't mean it's not real. It's just not something that I've ever actually considered in a serious manner. Not throwing away
seems to be lost on most Australians.
Go for it.
We host large components of the United States space warfighting capability through ground station networks here because our outback geography and the number of cloud-free days allows us to distribute redundancies that allows the United States to orchestrate space warfare, which is pivotal. Now, people who think we can walk away from escalating tensions between China and the United States are deluding themselves.
I'm not suggesting that. I'm not suggesting that.
That China would seek to take off the table within the first seconds of any operation against Taiwan. But neutrality
I'm not disagreeing with that, Catherine. What I'm saying is that thought, that train of thought, is something that I believe would be quite foreign to most of us. And so the conversation is, if the Prime Minister needed to be more robust, as you've suggested, is that something that comes at it like a bull at a gate, or is that something that's done more subtly, more incrementally? But
I think the Prime Minister has people close to him. I think the Prime Minister has people he respects close to him, urging him to take custody of this immediately. And Corey, you had a background as well and pointed out to the policy failings under Turnbull and Pyne. I think Scott Morrison is made of sterner stuff. What's your read on that yourself?
Well, I think he is made of sterner stuff, and also the circumstances have changed. But there are two interesting points that both Nicholas and Gemma have raised. Gemma, military intervention or an invasion of another country is not something that's left to a bygone era. It was only a couple of years ago that Russia invaded the Ukraine and annexed parts of the Ukraine, and the world
not disagreeing with that, Corey.
Yeah,
the Australian theatre is very different.
Yes, it is, but it starts somewhere, and the risk we have already in the South China Sea and with Taiwan, I think, is significant. But there was another point that Nicholas raised, and I don't want to verbal you, Nicholas. I'll do that later on if I need to. But you kind of suggested that China were relatively unsophisticated. That's not the word you used, but unsophisticated, that's my word, on the world stage in global diplomacy. I actually can't agree with that. I think they are truly cunning in how they go about their business, because they know that no one really wants to take them on because we've been dependent on them economically. Is that what you meant, or have I actually verbaled you in this space?
Look, you have. I mean, I think they're ham-fisted in the way they manage diplomacy. Like, you just look at some of the histrionics that you see in the Global Times, and the Australian ambassador, the Chinese ambassador to Australia. You hear some of the stuff he says, and it's beyond the pale. I think we all agree with that. My point, though, is, I mean, it's not surprising that Gemma has to disclose that, you know, she's got clients that are Chinese investors in Australia. I also work at a university, you know, and there's hundreds of thousands of Chinese students in Australia, and that's fantastic for Australia. You're from the great state of South Australia, Corey, and your biggest export is international education. Again, it's all coming from China. There's millions of Australians whose livelihoods and the prosperity of the country depends upon good relations between Australia and China. So I'm not trying to downplay the security stuff at all. I'm just saying, let's not be stupid about how we handle it, and let's not blow our economic brains out just because we overreact on the military front.